At 11:55 tonight, give or take a few seconds, one way or the other, I'm not entirely sure, I will be 37 years old. So old. Although this morning I came into my office to get my notes off my desk, and there was this big bag from Five Below in my chair, and I was like, somebody left me a present. I dropped them off yesterday for youth group tonight. So, anyway. It's starting to click. It's not uncommon around birthdays and other milestones to begin to kind of reflect and ask questions. And even like hearing the kids, like thinking back to my kids. My son was coming up the stairs at me yesterday, and I was like, who's this tall man? And then remembering like that was me at one point, and I was my parents at one, and it's just this interesting time of wondering like how did I get here? And where am I going? And what's next? And maybe not necessarily even physically, like in this space right this moment, but as a person, how did I get here? And where am I going? And what's next? And so this morning, on the day of my birth, celebrating a little over 13,000 years of life, I'm standing in front of a church like I have most Sundays for the past 15 years, about to talk about Jesus. And I just want to spend our time together telling you how and why that's the case. I know that sometimes I can cram a lot of words into a sermon. And so I just want to say, if I'm ever up here and you hear something that confuses you or you have questions about, I welcome that conversation. So please don't hesitate. Even I don't know sometimes the words that come out of my mouth. But I do know these words. Matthew 16, verses 13 through 16 say this. Now when Jesus came to the area of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, who do people say the human one is, the Son of Man? Who do people say that I am? They replied, some say John the Baptist, others Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the other prophets. That's pretty good company. Jesus asked, what about you? Who do you say that I am? Simon Peter said, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Who do you say that I am? When I was 19 years old, for the very first time voluntarily as an adult, and the first time at all in several years, I walked into a church on a Wednesday night to a Bible study. A week, maybe, tops, had gone by since I was the victim of an attempted armed robbery. And walking into that church on that Wednesday night, I was still shaking on the inside. Now, I hadn't been in a church in a while. I hadn't been in a Bible study ever. But I do know that walking into that church, and even up until this day, I've never really feared hell. And I know that that's how a lot of people's faith stories begin, but not mine. I've never really feared hell, but I have feared a lot of other things. I've feared abandonment. I've feared not being good enough or not measuring up. I have feared making the right choices or making the wrong choices. So much so that it stirs a preposterous amount of anxiety in me. I've been married for 15 years. I've known my wife for 20. And I still fear, to some degree, the ability to stand before another human being and be vulnerably, completely, nakedly myself. I fear being alone. And throughout my life, I have found myself alone many times. And I've been haunted by, and perhaps we all have, a nagging feeling of incompleteness, a fear of never being whole. And in that church, in that headspace, all those years ago, all those fears were stirred to the surface by this terror and this tension and this adrenaline and this recently realized mortality. And that night, a scared, insecure kid was introduced to a God that looked a lot like his dad. A disciplinarian type. The kind that you wanted to listen to and listen well. And if you did a good enough job, you might just get a smile out of him. And that's kind of a caricature, and I'm not trying to be mean-spirited. And the point is, that was simply the image of God that I was presented with. And the funny thing about it is, I was 100% okay with that image of God because I had gotten really good at playing the role of the good son striving for someone's approval. And that's what we do. We adopt scripts with all these existential terrors and tensions that we tell ourselves we'll grow out of, even when we look in the mirror in our mid-30s or 40s or however long, we're still wrestling with the very same things. We adopt these scripts, these roles, these conceptions of reality that we can then play act, we can embody, we can perform. And they provide us with a built-in sense of self and a lens to interpret our world. They quiet the terror and the tension for the most part. And a lot of these frameworks, these scripts, these concepts, these forms, we inherit them, right? They're generational. So they're rooted in our family of origin. So some of us have grown up in church our whole lives. This is part of the generational thing that we do. Part of our forms, our concepts, our realities are shaped by our family's social status, our positions. I was raised in a trailer park in southwestern Virginia. That has profoundly shaped me in some really good ways, actually. I'm wearing slippers on Sunday morning. I don't know what that has to do with anything, but I don't think they're slippers, but my wife seems to. Our gender, the color of our skin. We inherit from birth these forms and these stories and these scripts. And others we choose, like a 19-year-old kid walking into a Bible study. I was really good at playing Christian son, striving for the approval of his heavenly Father. A couple years into this routine of Bible study and Sunday morning and Wednesday night, throughout my Christian journey, I realized that there was this way of moving and being and belonging and operating in the Christian world that could provide a young man with myself with this semblance of arrival. I could climb a ladder and still my ego could seek a sense of validation. And that thing is Christian leadership. I could be a pastor. A pastor, that could be me. A new lead role, a title. I could do that. I could tell that story with my life. As a matter of fact, the testimony I told the very first Sunday I was here was that I was sitting in film school and I decided I would tell the Jesus story with the rest of my life by becoming a pastor. And God would be pleased. And people might admire me. And maybe be influenced or affected by something that I said or did. And maybe, just maybe, that nagging sense of incompleteness that had haunted me my whole life would go away. Maybe finally, by playing a new role, I could be made whole. So at 22, I dove headfirst into ministry. I created a life and a livelihood and a worldview and identity that was all shaped around being a good Christian pastor and doing what good Christian pastors do. And the funny thing is, that didn't really look any different than all the other ways I've strived for approval and validation in my life. I would give myself over and continue to give myself over to the forms and routines that conform me best to what I think other people are expecting from me, so that I can present myself as a tried and true worker, as one who could live a life worthy of the calling. My problem was, and is often the church's problem, that I and we often mistake education and conformity with wisdom and transformation. I spent years learning all the right answers and learning how to defend them. And looking back, instead of inspiring a robust spiritual life, I realized I was often only experiencing and interacting with people and ideas and spiritual realities through inherited, uncritical, inflexible cliches. And I was still haunted by the same fears, by the same whispers, "You're not good enough. Nothing you do will ever matter, no matter how much you try." Or, on a really bad day, "This is all just an existential crapshoot and it's all going down the drain." We use a lot of things to quiet those voices. I just happened to stumble upon a method that many before me had, using religion and leadership as a coping mechanism. Instead of losing myself completely to and in the love, the source, the deeper reality that I was truly longing and searching for. And one tiny earthquake in my soul led to another, and it all proved unstable and unsustainable. And that whisper, I realize now, it was not the voice of God. It was not the voice of the divine, the sacred, the most real. It was just an over-amplification of the lying voice of sin and fear. And about 10 years into my Christian journey, it all collapsed on me like a house of cards, like a house built on sand. Matthew 16. From that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he had to go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders, the chief priest, and the legal experts, and that he had to be killed and raised on the third day. Then Peter took hold of Jesus and, scolding him, began to correct him. "God forbid, Lord, this will not happen to you." But Jesus turned to Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stone that could make me stumble, for you are not thinking God's thoughts, but human thoughts." You are not thinking God's thoughts, but human thoughts. I was as lost as I have ever been. Like a gobsmacked Peter, humbled to his core. And I spent an awful lot of time just wading through the rubble. And at first, I was absolutely furious. Because this is not how my story is supposed to go. I was bitter. I was resentful. I had just come to the edges of my inherited and adopted reality, and it all just fell apart. Not God, not Jesus, not the really real stuff, just everything else. my faith felt like a forgery, like plagiarism, like I had been copying someone else's homework. I was a mess. I was disintegrating, and that is exactly what was supposed to be happening. Because the systems and the roles and the scripts that I had propped up my weary soul and burdened bones with, well-intentioned as they had been, the things that had taught me how to talk and how to think about God had also proven incredibly capable of allowing me to insulate myself from the true call of God to come to a complete end of myself. The roles we play, the lines we read, the scripts we live, all our careful religious practice, the systems and the institutions that we use to make meanings of this thing we call life, all of it can keep us in routines. We can learn the rhythms and the rules, and all the boundaries are roped off for our safety. But if God is God, then God is not safe. And God is not interested in our safety. Safety and stability is not what we need. We need an encounter with the living, undomesticated Spirit of God. Without it, we'll end up exactly like I did. My religious practice and rule-keeping and defending of the faith only proved beneficial in creating an inability for me to see my deepest needs were still unfulfilled, and my deepest wounds remained unmended. Religion is the mask we put on when we don't know that we are fully accepted. This is the same spiritual blindness that enabled the Apostle Peter to look Jesus in the face and say, God forbid, Lord. These are human thoughts, not God's thoughts. Verse 24. Then Jesus said to his disciples, all who want to come after me must say no to themselves. Take up their cross and follow me. All who want to save their lives will lose them. But all who lose their lives because of me will find them. Why would people gain the whole world but lose their lives, their souls? What will people give in exchange for their lives? Here at Caesarea Philippi, Jesus is interpreting both his identity and our participation in the way of Jesus, in following the Christ through the lens and language of suffering, death, and resurrection. However, human history, heck, even recent history, this week's news, is littered with self-centered, self-destructive, often collective tendencies of ours to pursue privilege and power and winning at the expense of others. Centuries of evidence that we will defend the inherited or adopted roles we play and our conceptual realities, be they social, political, or religious, by making others suffer at deadly cost. As such, a variety of social, political, and even religious narratives have proven incredibly powerful at insulating us all from the true call of God to come to a complete end of ourselves. Author and theologian C. Baxter Kruger says the word sin is the best word to describe this spiritual cancer that destroys our humanity and our existence. It's whatever happened that allows a deep and pervasive alienation to develop in our very beings, to fester. Due to this corruption, he says, we are locked into a cycle of anxiety and projection and misperception. It took me a while to get to the point of realizing that sin is not a result of human nature, but a betrayal of it. All manner of sin alienation, anxiety, evil, wrongdoing, injustice, and oppression. It is always ever a product and manifestation of our idolatrous dedication to putting ourselves first when we were made for each other. Sin, in all its signs and systems and the things it feeds and sustains, is a betrayal of human nature, and the way of Christ, the call of Christ, is to journey back to our true nature. But that is a journey through suffering and death and resurrection. The death of Christ, this is the good news, was our death. And there and then in Jesus Christ, the human race was crucified, dead, and buried. That on the cross of Calvary, our disease, our estrangement, our alienation, our flesh was crucified. Paul says in Galatians 2:20, I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. And the life that I now live in my body, I live by faith. Indeed, by the faithfulness of God's Son, who loved me and gave himself for me. About 10 years into my Christian journey, and it was this collapse, this crisis that was absolutely necessary to create space in my religious rhythms, Christian as they were, to allow me to actually hear and follow the genuine voice of God. And at the bottom, after the nightmare, love. The true voice of Christ reminds us, all who want to come after me must say no to themselves, take up their cross and follow me. All those who lose their lives because of me will find them. This is paired with a warning of the inverse, though. All who want to save their lives will lose them. Say no to yourself. Some translations say, deny thyself. Overcome, deny, say no to the self that you think you are because of the lying voice of sin and fear. The self that you've been told that you are, that phantom version of yourself that you spend so much time worrying and trying to become. Say no to that and instead make room in your life for the love of God to come forward, and those trivial things will recede. This is a deep, abiding life of faith and contemplation that steers into the mystery of God, in deep devotion to God, completely losing ourselves to and in the unconquerable love of God. Doing some self-editing as we go. You realize as you preach enough that like when you start writing sermons, you're like, I have a lot of good ideas. And you're like, some of these are the same thing. Just sit with it though. At the bottom, after the nightmare, love. Everything. It's grounded and rooted in love. Any voice that steers us away from love cannot be that which is true. As I look back over my life and my faith journey over these years in ministry, I am not upset by what preceded today. It is, after all, a part of me and a part of my story, and I do not regret it. But I can acknowledge that what I thought was supposed to be a neat, contained box needed some growing edges. And if our faith, if it is truly alive, it should evolve. It should take new shapes and forms over time. Our eyes should be opened as we are truly re-alivened. Yet the one thing that remains consistent through all of it for me is this. Jesus Christ reveals to us the deepest dimension of what it means to be truly human and truly alive. Jesus reveals that every person, all people, every kind of person has the potential to become whole, to be re-enlivened and awakened to their infinite worth and value and dignity and potential. And perhaps most amazing about this is that the gospel tells us that everything that needed to happen in order for us to participate in that true aliveness has already happened. And we're all invited. We're all called to participate in it, to collaborate, and to co-create. As Ephesians 2 said, salvation is God's gift, and we are God's accomplishment, created in Christ Jesus to do good things. The things God planned for us from the very beginning. We're an emerging creature. Our story is incomplete. Even our universe is evolving and expanding, propelled by the breath of God who diversifies and creates and energizes and sustains it all. And God says, this is good, let's go. And I believe that as our story unfolds, we have a role to play. Not just as individuals, but collectively. But it will remain impossible for us to do so. Impossible to sacrifice my good for the livelihood of others if we continue to play act, perform, and embody ways of being, religious or not, that prevent us from encountering the wild, undomesticated spirit of the living God. Praise band, would you come back up while I finish? The true, life-giving, genuine voice says to all of us, let go of who you think you are and who you've been told you need to be. Who you need to be good, to be whole, to be brilliant or successful. There's nothing wrong with you, the real you, the true you. The you that came into this creation through love, to love, and to be loved. So to answer my own questions from the start of this thing, that's how I got here. And that's where I'm going, and that's what's next. Who I thought I was, who I thought I needed to be is dead. And I fought it every step of the way. Who I am is dying, and the mystery of that is daily confusing and terrifying and unbearable. But who I am becoming, by the grace of the wild, undomesticated Spirit of the living God, and the ground of love at the bottom of it all, who I am becoming will look more and more like the true me. One who, like the Christ, keeps pouring himself out for the life of the world. So cheers to the end of me. And if you want to tag along, then cheers to the end of you too. May we who lose our lives truly find them. Amen.